Angelo Mureda is a film critic and curator who teaches at the University of Toronto. Also, his last name is almost Murder, and Angelo Murder would be a great villain name. Anyway,
with a PhD in disabled representation in film, he has a unique insight into cartoon villains.
The villains of Batman have always just been so simple to me.
Ah, sunshine.
The rogues gallery in Batman is always the appeal, right? Like, the Batman villains are why you care about Batman.
How true, how true.
As a child growing up with a disability, you sort of look to bad guys who are depicted often as being marginalized, as being outcasts, as being a little bit different, sometimes physically different, sometimes cognitively different. And you sort of associate yourself with those villains, I think, if you find yourself feeling like an outcast sometimes, and I certainly did.
Well, well, a codfish on a hook. I'll get you for this, man, if it's the last thing I do.
The foppish disabled villain in all his glory.
Right.
Villains typically have some sort of visual distinction to them. Maybe they're scrawny where the hero is strong. Maybe they have some kind of visual facial marker or a limb difference that identifies them as being different and outre in some way. And I think that's one reason that villains are often coded as disabled or coded as being from marginalized communities, because they need to be physically different in some way from the hero. What does the hero represent? Core institutional values like the family or faith in prosperity and the future, capitalism, right? There are all these positive institutional values that get associated with the hero that they're trying to protect. Okay, well, what are the threats to those values? What are the things that might tear that apart? And so sometimes that logic, I think, will take writers into problematic, ideologically troubling directions, and sometimes that results in them coding those characters as being different in some way or as being threatening in some way.
Disney is so notorious and famous for setting up these grand stories with these larger-than-life heroes, but even larger-than-life villains, specifically in WALL-E.
WALL-E is a really interesting example, I think, where in other Disney movies, disabled villains in particular are kind of out there with their disability. You've got Scar, who is visibly disabled and announces himself as a villain partly because he's got his visible scar. Whereas in WALL-E, it's more coded, it's more ideological, it's more in the kind of bones of the story than in something that is outward that you can see. It's a film that is very anxious about the possibility of humanity sort of becoming a lesser version of itself. It's working with some rather disturbing ableist imagery, particularly related to wheelchairs.
A few virtual balls in space.
Now, we did that yesterday. I don't want to do that.
For wheelchair users, I think wheelchairs are typically mobility devices that activate things in your life, right? That allow you to do things that enable you to actually be a more advanced version of yourself, right? So for a film to really depict the wheelchair as the source of humanity's fall, right? The source of humanity's flaw is that they're not standing on their own 2 feet again, I think is kind of troubling and lazy in some ways.